Have you ever wondered why a region of France is called Normandy? Why does this word sound so different from typical French place names like Provence, Burgundy, or Aquitaine? The answer is written in blood, steel, and DNA. Normandy means land of the Northmen, and the Northmen were Vikings. For over a century, dragon-prowed longships terrorized the coast of France. These weren't just raids, this was systematic conquest, and what began as pillaging ended with something no one expected. The Vikings became French. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. These Christianized French-speaking descendants of Norse raiders didn't fade into history. They went on to conquer England. They carved out kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily. They led crusades to the Holy Land. The Norman dynasty that emerged from Viking warlords would reshape medieval Europe more than almost any other power. Today, millions of people living in France, England, Italy, and beyond carry the genetic legacy of these Northmen in their DNA. Modern genetic studies have revealed that between 10 and 15% of the population in Normandy carries distinct Scandinavian genetic markers, over 1,000 years after the Vikings supposedly disappeared. This is the story of the most successful Viking settlement in history. This is the story of how Vikings became Normans. This is the story of how your DNA might be far more Nordic than you ever imagined. To understand how Vikings became French nobility, we need to go back to the late 8th century, when the Viking Age exploded across Europe. On June 8, 793 AD, Viking raiders struck the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. But England wasn't the Vikings' only target. The monasteries and kingdoms of Francia, modern-day France, were wealthy, fragmented, and vulnerable. The Seine River became a highway of destruction. Vikings discovered that their shallow draft longships could navigate deep into the heart of Francia, striking rich monasteries and towns far from the coast. Places like Rouen, Tours, and even Paris itself fell victim to repeated attacks. In 820 AD, Vikings raided the monastery at Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire River, and by 841 AD they had established a permanent winter camp there, the first Viking settlement on Frankish soil. This wasn't raiding anymore. This was colonization. The Frankish chronicles paint a picture of absolute chaos. In 845 AD, a Viking chieftain named Ragnar, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok himself, sailed up the Seine with 120 ships. King Charles the Bald could not stop them. Ragnar besieged Paris on Easter Sunday, March 28, 845 AD. Charles was forced to pay £7,000 of silver, an enormous fortune, to convince Ragnar to leave. The Vikings took the money and left, but they had learned a crucial lesson the Franks would pay to avoid battle. This payment set a catastrophic precedent. It was called Danegeld, literally Danish tax. For the next 70 years, Viking fleets returned again and again, knowing that the fractured Frankish kingdoms would pay rather than fight. The monk Ermentarius of Noirmoutier, who lived through these attacks, wrote in despair, "The number of ships grows larger and larger. The endless flood of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere, Christ's people are the victims of massacre, burning, and plunder. The Vikings overrun all that lies before them, and none can withstand them." In 856 to 857 AD, a massive Viking fleet spent an entire winter on the Seine, raiding deep into Burgundy. In 858 AD, they attacked Paris again. In 861 AD, they burned Paris. In 865 AD, they returned yet again. The Frankish kingdom was bleeding silver and suffering. The kings tried everything, paying, negotiating, fighting, but nothing worked. The Vikings had discovered that Francia was a treasure chest with a broken lock. But the worst was yet to come. In November 885 AD, the largest Viking fleet ever assembled in Francia appeared at the mouth of the Seine. Contemporary sources claim there were 700 ships carrying between 30,000 and 40,000 warriors. Modern historians believe the true number was more like 300 ships with perhaps 10,000 men. Even at the lower estimate, this was an army large enough to conquer kingdoms. Leading this massive force was a chieftain named Sigfrid, though multiple Norse warlords commanded different sections of the fleet. their target was clear: Paris. But Paris in 885 AD was not the sprawling city we know today. It was a fortified island settlement called the Ile de la Cité, protected by wooden walls and two critical stone bridges crossing the Seine. If the Vikings could take Paris, they could sail upriver to plunder all of Burgundy. The Viking fleet arrived on November 25th, 885 AD, and immediately sent messengers to the Frankish defenders. Their demand was simple: let us pass, and Paris would be spared. Refuse, and they would take the city by force. The defence of Paris was led by Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin. Against impossible odds, they refused. Odo sent word to Emperor Charles the Fat, who ruled the divided Frankish Empire, begging for reinforcements, but Charles was far away, and help would not come quickly. The siege began in earnest on November 26, 885 AD. The Vikings constructed siege towers, wheeled wooden structures, taller than Paris's walls, covered in water-soaked animal hides to prevent fire. They built battering rams. They filled sections of the river with rubble to create causeways for attack. Abbo Cernius, a monk who witnessed the siege, wrote a detailed Latin poem describing the assault. According to Abbo, the Vikings attacked with a din of trumpets and horns and launched flaming arrows into the city. The defenders poured boiling oil, pitch and wax onto attackers attempting to scale the walls. They hurled stones and spears from the ramparts. Bishop Goslin himself, despite his religious role, organised the defence. Medieval chronicles describe him blessing the defenders while simultaneously directing the military response, a warrior priest in the truest sense. The Vikings attacked the walls repeatedly. They tried to undermine the fortifications by digging beneath them. They launched assault after assault against the stone bridges, trying to break through or burn them down. On January 20th, 886 AD, disaster struck the defenders. Heavy winter rains caused the Seine to flood. The rising water destroyed the smaller of the two bridges, the Grand Pont, leaving the tower on that bridge isolated and surrounded by Vikings. 12 Frankish knights held that tower. The Vikings offered them their lives in exchange for surrender. Every single knight refused. They fought until they were overwhelmed and killed, to the last man. With the bridge destroyed, the Vikings could now sail past Paris on one side of the island. But they didn't leave. They wanted the city itself. The siege continued. Bishop Goslin died of illness in April 886 AD, but Count Odo fought on. Food ran low, disease spread, yet Paris held. The siege lasted for 10 months. Finally, in October 886 AD, Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with a Frankish army. The Vikings, seeing a large force approaching, prepared for battle, but Charles did not attack. Instead, he negotiated. Charles the Fat paid the Vikings 700 pounds of silver, the same amount paid 41 years earlier. He also gave them permission to sail up the Seine into Burgundy to plunder territories that had rebelled against him. The Vikings accepted and left. Count Odo, who had defended Paris heroically, was furious. The Frankish nobility was outraged. Charles the Fat had paid the Vikings and let them loot his own empire rather than fight them. This humiliation would have consequences. In 887 AD, Charles the Fat was deposed. In 888 AD, Count Odo was elected King of West Francia. But the Vikings had learned something crucial during that siege. While they had failed to take Paris by force, they had proven that they could not be dislodged once they settled. And the Franks, for all their armies, lacked the unity and leadership to drive them out. A new strategy emerged among Viking leaders. Why fight for temporary plunder when you could negotiate for permanent land? Around the year 890 AD, a new Viking leader emerged in Francia. His name was Rollo, and he would change the course of European history. We know frustratingly little about Rollo's early life. Medieval Norse sagas claim he was born in Norway, the son of a powerful earl named Rognvald of Mura. The sagas say he was called Gungu Rolfa, Rollo the Walker, because he was so large that no horse could carry him, so he walked everywhere. Whether this story is true, we don't know. But we do know that, by the early 890s, a Viking chieftain named Rollo was operating in Francia, and he was impossibly ambitious. Unlike previous Viking leaders who raided and left, Rollo understood something fundamental. The Frankish kingdom was falling apart. After the death of Charlemagne in 814 AD, his empire had been divided among his grandsons. By Rollo's time, These divisions had created a patchwork of competing kingdoms, duchies, and counties, all fighting each other. Rollo saw opportunity. In 911 AD, Rollo laid siege to Chartres, a wealthy town southwest of Paris. King Charles the Simple, yes, that was his actual title, though simple meant straightforward, not stupid, marched to defend the city. But Charles didn't want another siege. He didn't want to pay more Danegeld, and he certainly didn't want Vikings raiding indefinitely. So Charles proposed something radical. He would give Rollo land, permanent land, territory in northern Francia, centred on the lower Seine River valley, including the city of Rouen. In exchange, Rollo would convert to Christianity, swear fealty to Charles as his vassal, and defend Francia against other Viking raiders. This was the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, signed in 911 AD. Think about the genius of this agreement. Charles was essentially hiring Vikings to fight Vikings. He was creating a buffer state between the heart of Francia and the Scandinavian raiders, and he was transforming a dangerous enemy into a theoretically loyal vassal. For Rollo, this was everything he wanted. He got land, legitimacy, and the right to rule. His men got farms, towns, and a future beyond endless raiding. According to later Norman chronicles, the treaty ceremony was both solemn and hilarious. Rollo was required to kneel before Charles and kiss the king's foot as a sign of submission and homage. But Rollo, proud Viking that he was, refused to kneel. Instead, he had one of his men lift Charles's foot to Rollo's face. The man lifted the foot so high that Charles fell backward, causing the assembled nobles to burst into laughter. Whether this story is true or embellished, it captures something real. The Vikings were becoming part of Frankish society, but they weren't becoming meek. They were bringing their own culture, their own pride, and their own way of doing things. Rollo took the Christian name Robert at his baptism. His territory was called the Northmenorum, in Latin, the land of the Northmen. Over time, this became Normannia, and eventually Normandy. But here's the crucial question. What happened to the Vikings who settled there? Did they remain Scandinavian? Did they become French? Or did something entirely new emerge? The transformation of Vikings into Normans happened with shocking speed. Rollo himself, baptized as Robert, encouraged his followers to intermarry with the local Frankish population. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in early Normandy shows this cultural blending clearly. Norse-style weapons appear in graves, alongside Christian crosses. Frankish pottery sits next to Scandinavian jewellery. By the second generation, Rollo's son William Longsword, who ruled from 927 to 942 AD, the Norman elite spoke French as their primary language, not Old Norse. The Normans adopted French law, French customs, and French feudal organisation. This is remarkable. In England, Danish Vikings maintained their language and culture for generations. The Dane law remained distinctly Scandinavian for over 150 years. But in Normandy, within 50 years, Norse language had nearly disappeared. Why? Several reasons. First, Rollo's Vikings were likely a relatively small group, perhaps 2,000 to 5,000 warriors plus their families, settling among a much larger Frankish population. They were the elite, but they were outnumbered. Second, Rollo actively promoted integration. He needed the local Frankish nobles and clergy to accept Norman rule. The fastest way to do that was to adopt their culture and religion. Third, the Normans inherited a sophisticated Frankish administrative system. Francia had been part of the Carolingian Empire, with written law codes, organised church hierarchies, and complex land ownership systems. To rule effectively, the Normans had to work within this system. But, and this is crucial, the Normans didn't abandon everything Scandinavian. They kept the Viking spirit of aggression, expansion, and military excellence. They kept Viking shipbuilding techniques. They kept the Norse love of adventure and conquest. What emerged was a hybrid culture, French in language and law, but Viking in ambition and military culture. William Longsword expanded Norman territory westward toward Brittany. His son, Richard I, fought off Frankish attempts to retake Normandy. By the year 1000 AD, Normandy was firmly established as one of the most powerful duchies in Francia. The Normans built castles, lots of castles. They introduced the modern and Bailey design, a wooden tower atop an artificial hill surrounded by a defensive enclosure. This military architecture would spread across Europe and defined medieval warfare. They also became patrons of monasteries. The Norman dukes founded or refounded abbeys like Jumièges, Fécamp, and Mont Saint-Michel. They brought religious reform and supported the Catholic Church. Ironic, considering their pagan Viking ancestors had burned monasteries less than a century earlier. Genetically, something fascinating was happening. Viking men who settled in Normandy often married Frankish women. The children of these unions were culturally Norman, but carried both Scandinavian and Frankish DNA. Modern genetic studies have analysed this mixing. A 2015 study by Cassidy et al., examining ancient DNA from Normandy burials, found clear evidence of Scandinavian Y chromosome haplogroups I1 and R1a appearing in Norman samples from the 10th and 11th centuries. These haplogroups are rare in the general French population, but common in Scandinavia. However, the mitochondrial DNA passed down through the female line shows predominantly local Frankish origins. This confirms what historical records suggest. Viking men married local women, creating a genetically mixed but culturally unified Norman population. By the early 11th century, a new generation had arisen. They didn't think of themselves as Vikings pretending to be French, or Franks pretending to be Vikings. They were Normans, a distinct people with their own identity, and this identity would explode onto the European stage in ways no one could have predicted. In January 1066 AD, King Edward the Confessor of England died without a clear heir. 3 men immediately claimed the English throne. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, was crowned king by the English nobles. Harold Hardrada, the legendary King of Norway, claimed the throne based on old Viking agreements, and William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. William was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo. He was a direct descendant of Vikings, but he ruled a French duchy, spoke French, and lived as a French nobleman. He was Norman, through and through. William insisted that Harold had sworn an oath to support William's claim to the English throne. When Harold took the crown for himself, William declared him an oath-breaker and prepared for war. On September 28, 1066, William's fleet crossed the English Channel, the same waters Viking raiders had crossed for centuries. But this wasn't a raid. This was an invasion force of 7,000 men, including 2,000 to 3,000 cavalry, something Vikings had never deployed effectively. King Harold was in northern England, having just defeated Harold Hardrada's Norwegian Viking army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. When news came that William had landed in Sussex, Harold force-marched his army 250 miles south in less than 2 weeks. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met at Senlac Hill near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings is one of the most famous battles in history, and for good reason. Harold's English army held the high ground with a shield wall, the traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive formation. William's Normans attacked uphill with cavalry, archers and infantry. The battle raged all day. The Norman cavalry repeatedly charged the shield wall, but couldn't break it. Harold's elite housecarls, heavily armoured axemen, cut down Norman knights and horses. But the Normans had tactical flexibility that pure Vikings lacked. William feigned retreat multiple times, luring sections of the English shield wall to break formation and chase, then turning and cutting them down. Norman archers fired high-arcing volleys over the shield wall, forcing the English to raise their shields and creating openings for cavalry charges. Later in the day, King Harold was killed, likely by an arrow to the face, though accounts vary. With their king dead, the English army broke and fled. William had won. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest transformed England forever. William replaced the entire English aristocracy with Norman nobles. French became the language of the English court for the next 300 years. Norman law, Norman architecture, and Norman culture dominated England. But here's what's fascinating from a genetic perspective. The Normans who conquered England were themselves descended from Vikings who had conquered Francia just 150 years earlier. Viking DNA didn't enter England only during the earlier Viking Age. It came again with the Normans. Studies like the 2015 People of the British Isles Genetic Survey found that regions of England with the highest Norman settlement, particularly eastern and southern England, showed genetic markers that overlap with both Normandy and Scandinavia. You can't separate the genetic contribution of the earlier Danes from the later Normans because both groups carried Scandinavian ancestry. The English language itself bears witness to this. While English retained its Germanic core from the Anglo-Saxons, it absorbed thousands of French words from the Norman conquerors. Words like government, justice, prison, parliament, duke, prince, and crown are all Norman French. Even the names of meats, beef from French boeuf versus cow, pork from French pork versus pig, reflect the fact that Norman nobles ate the meat while English peasants raised the animal. William the Conqueror ruled England for 21 years, dying in 1087 after a riding accident. But the Norman dynasty continued. His sons became kings. His nobles became the English aristocracy. Every English and British monarch since 1066 has descended from William the Conqueror. Think about that. The current British royal family, including King Charles III, carries the DNA of Rollo the Viking. That's a direct genetic line from Norse raiders to the throne of England. But the Normans didn't stop with England. While William was conquering England, other Normans were carving out kingdoms in the Mediterranean. In the early 11th century, groups of Norman adventurers, often younger sons with no inheritance, travelled south to Italy seeking fortune and land. What started as mercenary work became conquest. Robert Guiscard, a Norman knight from a minor noble family, arrived in southern Italy around 1047 AD. Within 20 years, he had conquered most of southern Italy and expelled the Byzantine Greeks, who had ruled there for centuries. His brother Roger the Firm conquered Sicily between 1061 and 1091 AD, defeating the Muslim emirs who had controlled the island for over 200 years. The Norman kingdom of Sicily became one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated states in medieval Europe. Roger II, Robert Guiscard's nephew, crowned himself King of Sicily in 1130 AD. His kingdom blended Norman military culture with Byzantine administration and Islamic scholarship. Arabic scholars worked alongside Greek philosophers and Latin monks in Roger's court. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, built by Norman kings, combines Norman architecture with Byzantine mosaics and Arabic geometric designs. It's one of the most stunning buildings in Europe. This is Viking DNA at work again. The same restless hunger for conquest that drove Rollo to Francia drove his distant cousins to Italy and Sicily. The Norman kingdom of Sicily lasted until 1194 AD and profoundly influenced Mediterranean culture. Normans also participated in the Crusades. Bohemond of Taranto, Robert Guiscard's son, was one of the leaders of the First Crusade. In 1098 AD, he became Prince of Antioch, establishing a Norman Crusader state in the Holy Land that lasted until 1268 AD. Think about the geographic spread. Within 200 years of Rollo's settlement in Normandy, his descendants ruled Normandy itself, all of England, southern Italy and Sicily, Antioch in the Middle East. This is one of the most remarkable expansions of any medieval people, and it all traces back to Vikings who became French. So what happened to the Vikings genetically? If Normans became French-speaking and adopted French culture, did their Scandinavian DNA disappear? No, it's still there. You can find it in modern populations across France, England, Italy, and beyond. Let's look at the hard evidence. A comprehensive 2015 genetics study published in Nature by researchers at Oxford University examined DNA samples from across France. They found that populations in Normandy show elevated frequencies of Y chromosome haplogroups I1 and R1a, both strongly associated with Scandinavian ancestry. Specifically, around 10 to 15% of men in Normandy carry KIM1 or R1a markers, compared to just 3 to 5% in southern France. This difference is statistically significant and directly correlates with regions of known Viking settlement. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The same study found that these Scandinavian markers aren't evenly distributed across Normandy. They're concentrated in coastal areas where Vikings initially landed, river valleys, particularly the Seine, where Vikings established settlements, areas around former Norman fortifications. This isn't random. It's a genetic map of Viking settlement patterns from over 1,000 years ago. Autosomal DNA testing, which looks at DNA from both parents, not just male or female lines, shows similar patterns. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA regularly find that customers from Normandy have 5 to 10% Scandinavian ancestry. One 2019 study by Margarian et al., published in Nature, sequenced ancient Viking DNA from burial sites across Scandinavia and Viking colonies. They found that Viking populations were themselves genetically diverse. Some Vikings had British or Irish ancestry from earlier raids and settlements, while others showed Eastern European markers. This means that Viking DNA isn't a single pure genetic category. Vikings were already a mixed population. When they settled in Normandy and mixed with the local Frankish population, they created an even more diverse genetic profile. But the Scandinavian contribution remains detectable because it introduced new genetic variants that were rare in Francia. The Norman elite, who were disproportionately of Viking descent, had more children due to their wealth and status. Norman expansion spread this DNA across Europe. In England, distinguishing Danish Viking DNA from Norman DNA is nearly impossible because Normans carried Scandinavian ancestry. A 2016 study by Leslie et al. Found that English populations show two distinct periods of Scandinavian genetic input, one from the Viking Age, 9th to 10th centuries, and another from the Norman period, 11th to 12th centuries. A 2015 study by Sarno et al. Found that approximately 5 to 7% of Sicilian DNA can be traced to northwest European sources, likely Norman. Even in the Middle East, there's evidence. Modern populations in parts of Syria and Lebanon, former territories of the Crusader states, show trace amounts of Western European DNA that likely arrived during the Crusades. While Normans were only one part of the crusading armies, they were a significant component, especially in the Principality of Antioch. So yes, the Vikings who became Norman became French culturally, but genetically they never fully disappeared. Their DNA is woven into the genetic fabric of Western Europe. DNA breaks down over generations. After 30 generations, roughly the time since Rollo, any single Viking ancestor contributes less than 1/1000th of your total DNA. The DNA is still there statistically, but it's spread so thin that it might not show up in testing. What's more reliable is historical genealogy. If your family tree traces back to Norman nobles, English aristocracy after 1066, or southern Italian nobility, you're almost certainly descended from Vikings who became Normans. Many English surnames indicate Norman ancestry. Names ending in ville, like Mandeville, Neville, names starting with Fitz, meaning son of, from French files, and names imported from Normandy, like Percy, Montgomery, Bruce, and Howard. In Normandy itself, surnames often reflect Viking origins. Names like Trondheim, Rouen, from the Norse Rhoda, and even surnames containing Thor, like Thorol or Torol, point to Norse roots. If you've enjoyed this documentary, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more upcoming videos.